Welcome to today's Practical Discipleship. I'm Pastor Dan DeBruler. I've got Pastor Eric Gray, Pastor Clay Davis here with me today. And we're talking today about the reliability of the Bible itself. You know, many people make claims that say it's an irrelevant document. You know, it's thousands of years old. It's all these stories that are combined by all these different writers, and somebody just put them together and we weave them into our own story. I don't believe that's the case. Where do you guys fit in that discussion?
King James only. No.
Amen. Okay, we're done.
Just kidding. Fully trust in the reliability and the applicability of the Bible to everyday life for every person. I mean, even for the non-believer, if they were just to, follow the guidance in Proverbs alone, or listen to if they only said, well, I'm going to ignore Paul, but I'm going to read and obey everything Jesus said in red letters, like the benefits they would experience in their life. They wouldn't necessarily receive salvation, right? That's not our belief, but just being able to apply the practical advice, the good direction that is provided for everybody to live, not necessarily a prosperous financially life, but you could, but that you would come to a wholeness of character. You'd be living in an attempt that would be mirroring a very righteous life.
Right. The easy answer to the question, how do I know that the Bible is reliable, is because I've tried it and it works.
There's that too.
I mean, that's the short, easy answer. We have all kinds of, I've got a bunch of stuff here with some different scholarly answers and how to deal with some of the criticisms but the bottom line is try it and see if it works, and you're going to find out that it does work. So all these other things, it's wonderful information to have, but for me, I don't need somebody else to tell me why the Bible is reliable, why I can depend on it, because my personal experience, not trying to elevate personal experience too high, but the thing is, I've tried it. I've tried stuff from the Old Testament, I've tried stuff from the New Testament, it just works.
And get beyond that, I get we can test it and we can see that it's true. We can see that it all rings true in our lives and our experiences and those experiences of those around us. But when you get down to the validity, the literal validity of it, there are people who claim that these things didn't happen. They make Nineveh this fairy tale city and so many things. And I find it really ironic, in what they called the Age of Enlightenment. There was a period of a few hundred years where reason became the thing, and we began to know all of these things. Science was a little bit different and evolving, and we began to discredit this timeless truth, what we consider a timeless truth. But right on the heels of that came all of these archaeological discoveries that began to validate so many things that could have been and were, in fact, dismissed as myths and tales and stories. We began to put some feet on these things, in the periods after that. You get into the 18 and 1900s, we began to see things proven out. And so I have to ask myself, where do the critics go now? When things become proven, where do the critics go?
Well, so it's all, there will always, for this, there's the scoffers, right? And I don't want to say critics, like those that are always looking for the excuse not to believe, and even if you were to provide them, hey, here is Noah's Ark, we found it. Here is the Ark of the Covenant, it's been revealed again, right? Like if you were to disclose all that, hey, we found all these things, we can put our hands on them, and they're described and measured exactly in the Bible as they present themselves, they'll be like, well, that doesn't actually mean it's a God thing. Like people wrote the book and did it. They would still disqualify. And so, but like I say, every year, every generation, we're offered new artifacts being found, new cities being discovered by archaeologists, right? The Dead Sea Scrolls, when those were discovered, that was an amazing thing. It wasn't new information. It was the same information, but it went back further, and it was a clear preservation of what people were saying. Well, that's a translation that's been lost and in translation time over time. And so we continue to encounter those things. I don't know what you tell the person who doesn't want to believe. We kind of know where their heart is. And I have a certain level of sympathy and pity for that person who just doesn't want to believe, because I know where they'll end up. But for those who are looking for truth, just because it's not out in the mainstream doesn't mean it's not available. You got to seek out the people who are trying to reveal those things to you. There are people like a Kent Hovind who just makes that information known all the time, whether through YouTube, whether through Facebook, whether through books he writes through. He's got his own museum you can go to, and he'll show you, he'll present you this information that you won't find in a science book in high school, right? That it's just not in the mainstream, but it's there, and it's tangible, and it's testable that, yeah, it is actually as old as we say it is, and it did come from where we say it came from, and it brings a great level of validity. My other level of, I guess the concern on the other side is for us to put too much faith in one artifact we find, right? Because what happens when all your faith is in, oh man, they found the Shroud of Turin and they tested it in these ways and now I believe. Well, what happens when somebody comes along later and says, well I tested it my way and it shows itself not to be true and it's counterfeit? At some point, we have to look at the authenticity of the text and say, there is consistency, everything's congruent, it is one solid message. It doesn't matter how many people held the pen, it was God authoring this whole thing, and you're going to have to take at least one step of faith to believe that.
Exactly. We have to realize that there is a degree of faith. Now, it's not blind faith, but how much evidence do you need? Because the big argument against the archaeological evidences that we have are, but the archaeology hasn't confirmed everything. Well, archaeology hasn't confirmed everything. You're absolutely right. But there are a lot of things that we have that we would believe about our history that we only know from the stories that were handed down. Archaeology hasn't necessarily confirmed these things, and archaeology. The other thing, they're still digging. They're still coming up with finding new things and new places. And I saw something that it's just in the last couple of years that the one of the pools, the Pool of Siloam, I believe it was, they have now. Not only did they discover it where they, evidence of it where the Bible led them to believe there was evidence, but they've now used a particular type of carbon dating that dates the materials to the time that the Bible says that it would have been there. So at some point you just have to go, okay, how much proof do you really need? And sometimes when we're having conversations with people, we have to just get real honest with them. If I could prove to you that the Bible was true right now, would you give your life to Christ? Would you change? And I've actually asked people that question, and they've said, well, no.
Same here.
At that point, then why are we having a conversation? If your mind is made up, and there's absolutely nothing that can convince you otherwise.
See, and all this brings us right back to where you started. We just have to look at how true it's been and how true things really ring and have become in our lives and the lives of those around us, and realize that there is a degree of faith that comes into play. Because I can find holes in every dating theory, and I'm talking about dating things back, how we determine how old something is, or how we determine something is valid because of these things. That comes from a knowledge base, and that knowledge has a limit to it. When we see lives transformed, as a result of having heard the truth of the Word of God, when we see people really begin to live their lives differently, to begin to focus in a different direction and bring other people along to their own betterment, we have to say there's something to this. There's something beyond even the text of the book, because sometimes that's what people are talking about. That's what they're arguing about. They're arguing about the fact that it's just a book. Well, it's not just a book. It's a series of records, and it's a series of teachings that have been transcribed for us to understand. And when we see that Jesus leaned heavily on this, and we see how his teaching plays out and affects the people, not just in that day and time, but how it continues to affect, and how just if you were only to apply the principles, and it didn't believe any of the other stuff, didn't believe any of the magical, mystical things of God about any of it, but you only applied the principles, and you saw how it affected change, positive change in the lives in your own life and in the lives of those around you. You have to say, man, there's something to this.
Yeah. I mean, there's lots of different ways we could go here. I know the argument is always presented, and at a certain level, it's circumstantial until you look at the volume of people that have chosen to go this way. And basically, like, the people who are willing to argue the point or their belief that they don't believe the Bible, that it lacks credibility, that it's not historically accurate, and therefore it takes away all its validity, those kind of things. One, I think all three of us affirm we believe it to be historically accurate, right? Mm-hmm. We believe it to be truth, not just relatively true, but it's truth. It's literally, you can build your life on it, and you can watch the fruit grow. But the people were willing, the guys who wrote this, the guys who did pen so much of the New Testament, right? Every one of them showed themselves willing to die, never contradicting a word they wrote. There's no evidence to that whatsoever. And for the scoffers that were putting them to death, they would have absolutely recorded and brought to light for everybody that, look, they doubted themselves in the end. They doubted their Savior. They recanted their testimony. There's no recording of that whatsoever that I'm aware of, right? I mean, even like go back to Old Testament. Moses, so he wasn't instructed by God to stay on the other side of the Jordan. No, he just chose to do it on his own. He just said, you know what, I'm just going to abstain from going to the promised land I've been leading people to for 40 years. No, he was directed, and he submitted himself to the authority of the Lord, who had been over him for 40 plus years at that point. And so you can just look at the behavior of the people in the story and at the end of their story, and every time it's consistent with what they're writing. I guess it's easy for us. Mm-hmm. It's easy for us because we've tried it, we've experienced it, we've seen, and I mean this conversation that we're trying to do in a relatively short period of time here. There are entire weekend-long conferences on ways that you can know and trust, and people have. I'm just going to be honest. People have some legitimate questions that they can ask about, well, what about the different variations, and how do we know that the text hasn't been corrupted over time? That's a legitimate question. There are some passages that may be considered problematic. But the reality of it is, I mean, even one scoffer, one critic points out that he says there are more variants than there are words in the New Testament. Well, okay, but most of those are spelling or word order. Well, okay, I'm not the greatest speller in the world, so you could probably find variants in me, issues with that, but they're all minor. And even those passages that they would say, well, these don't show up in the oldest manuscripts, they must have been added later. Even if you take those passages out, it doesn't change anything. And that's not our declaration. Like Bart Ehrman, who's like one
exactly,
of the...
that's who I was...
So he's the one who cites the volume of all those differences or deviations, right? But he also says, even if if you went to a script and you added all those deviations, it would not change the message. It would not change the core of what's being expressed throughout the text.
Exactly, and that's why it's very important for us as Christ followers not to pull one verse out of text, out of context, or even just pull one verse out and try to establish any type of doctrine or philosophy or anything based on one verse. All of what we believe, there's a consistent story. That collection of writings that spans 1,500 years, written in 3 different languages by at least 40 different people, it's consistent all the way through. Oh, but there are contradictions in the Bible. Well, no, they're not. You have to learn how to look at those things. Well, the creation story in Genesis 1 versus Genesis 2 looks different. Okay, well, yeah, I'm reminded of a movie that we saw. It came out many years ago called Vantage Point. Weird movie because it tells the same story, but you see it from this person's vantage point. Then you go back and you see it from somebody else's vantage point. And things may look a little different. Well, there's some differences in the Gospels. Well, okay, but do you understand that the gospel writers were writing, these weren't written to be, they were written as letters to specific groups of people. One Matthew was writing to the Jewish audience. So it was important that things were presented in a way. Mark was a little different. Luke was trying to put together an accurate historical record. So once you understand these things, that even the so-called contradictions, they're not contradictions.
Yeah, and as you keep going down that line, you arrive at John, and John was writing from the perspective of, look, it really happened. I was there. I mean, that's a quick summary paraphrase, of trying to appeal to people through the many signs that Jesus performed.
But not only that, I go back to J. Warner Wallace wrote a book called Person of Interest. And he was a criminal investigator, cold case investigator, and he decided to take, as a matter of fact, it's how he came to Christ. He decided to take everything he knew about investigating these cold cases that often you didn't have a whole lot to go on, and apply that to the scriptures. And he says, the differences or the variations that we see in the Gospels, he said that's what you would expect from eyewitness testimony in any case. He said, as a criminal investigator, you learn very quickly that if every eyewitness has the exact same story and they're telling the exact same wording and everything, that's a problem. They got together and they planned this out. These are coordinated stories. What you see with the Gospels is not variations of different story, or what you see is not different stories. It's variations that you would expect from different eyewitnesses having seen these events.
And the thing is, when you set out to disprove something and you've already got your conclusion in mind, you know where you're trying to arrive, well, you're probably going to arrive there one way or another, even if the evidence doesn't add up.
Right.
And when we open our minds and our hearts to the fact that we could be wrong, we can arrive at something a whole lot different. I mean, this is what happened with Lee Strobel.
Absolutely. I was thinking of him too.
I was going to say the list of people that have started out to disprove the scriptures, to prove that Jesus wasn't really who he said he was. That
were willing to ultimately concede to the truth, whatever it may be.
Yeah,
right?
but then found out that wait a second, in trying to disprove this, I actually wound up proving that it was true, and now I have to submit myself to the truth of the scriptures. It's just a long list.
And that's the truth of how we have to look at it. I didn't come in determining that I was going to arrive at this conclusion. I came in wondering what was messed up in my life. I mean, this is where I came into looking at the Bible in the first place. There's something wrong here. Things aren't working out the way that I thought they would. I'm not saying things are working out the way I thought they would now, but I'm saying I began to apply these principles that were taught. And you can go all the way back into the Old Testament and see how things add up to the things that we can do in our lives today. And you put these things into practice, into play in your life, and you realize, man, there's something to this. And so, the word timeless, I can't say it enough times. It becomes this timeless application of knowledge for us. And so if you're setting out to disprove it, well, that's where you'll land, most likely, especially if you've already determined where you're going to land before you start to disprove it or to prove it for that matter.
Yeah, and so to kind of tie that back to what you were saying with that investigator, right, to have that history, the person who has already decided the outcome they want, that's no different than a prosecutor that's rigging the case, right? That's no different than the detective that's planting the evidence. Like, I'm going to ignore this, I'm going to remove it from the crime scene, that way nobody else can apply it, and I'm going to plant this seed right here so that people would believe this instead. And the funny thing, so just on the topic of creation, right? We're willing to believe that it is how God says it is in his word, right? That he did it in a certain order, that he did it in a certain way, that he did it in a certain time frame. Now we trust that because there is somebody being instructed to write that to provide it for our own well-being so that we wouldn't be misdirected. Meanwhile, the people that refuse to believe that have typically allowed themselves to believe the theory of people who weren't there and don't have the ability to ever really go back and test or prove. They're operating on a greater level of faith than we are. They've got there is nobody 6,000 years ago writing down the history of how the first human being came around, right? That wasn't occurring. They're not operating off a story that's ever been told that this is how it happened. That actually your grandma was, a leopard, whatever. Your grandma was an ape, whatever. Those stories don't exist. They're literally operating off a theory within the last couple hundred years that ignores any storytelling, any historical references over the course of 1,000 years in between. Meanwhile, we're operating off the word of people who were there, who knew the person that was there before them and knew the person that was there before them. They knew their age, they knew where they came from, who their father was. I think it's so perfect and beautiful how when God lays it out in the Bible, he gives us the name, he gives us the age, he gives us the descendant, you know who the child is, you know who the father is, you know who the grandfather is. You can trace it all back. He gives us all that to give us greater confidence. Meanwhile, everybody else that refuses to believe that is operating on, a higher level, a greater amount of faith because they've got less evidence. They've got less trustworthy facts to go to,
And here's the reality: if they would apply the same level of I say criticism, in the academic sense, to what they claim they believe that they're applying to the Bible. If they would examine it in the same way, they would see that there's less to stand on over here than there is to stand on the scriptures. But like you said, it often comes down to, well, this is where I want to go, so I know the path to get there, versus I just want to know where's the truth. And we have to be careful about that, or we can even do that as well. We're not willing to look at things on one side the same way we're willing to examine things on the other. And we need to be consistent. And so I would challenge anybody that's watching this, if you have questions, are you applying the same level of criticism, or you the same level of questioning to what you believe, to what you are to the scriptures? Just use this as an example. They often say, well, the Bible was written by men. Okay, well, so was your history book. Do you question everything? I know we laugh at that, but do we question? Right. Do we question everything we're told about history because it was written down by men? Yet we're going to say, well, we can't believe the Bible because it was written by men. We have to be intellectually honest with ourselves and have some intellectual integrity. If that's the standard by which we accept or don't accept something, is was it written by men? Well, a lot of us, we're going to be in trouble to say, well, if it was written by men, I can't trust it.
Yeah. and I'll offer the anecdote for history is usually, right, that it's written by the victors, right? Those that lose the battles, those that are slave to the king, those aren't the ones writing history. Those aren't the ones that have the ability to write and describe and to continue that story on down the line. It's the ones who win. And so I'll just say, hey, for that, on that same line of thinking, that's who wrote the Bible. It's the one who won. Is the one who's got the victory in the eternal and most important battle ever. Like, just saying, if you like to read from what winners write, like, the Bible's good. It's a good story. And it's more than a good story. It's something you can apply to your whole life. So if that's your line of thinking, that, well, whoever wrote it is the winner, agreed.
Well, as we begin to wrap up today, let me just say, we've seen, even in our short lifespans, relatively, we've seen culture swing so many different ways. We've seen one thing come into vogue and another thing go out, and that's been the same all throughout human history. And we saw, as I alluded to earlier, the age of reason, the Enlightenment, it was doing everything it could to bury the Bible, to make it some archaic, irrelevant document. Archaeology in that case kept digging it back up. And so here we are. We're able to look at some of the trends, cultural trends in our world, even today. In the last 5-10 years, we can look at things that culture says is good, the law says is okay, and we realize that those cannot sustain life on this planet. And we have to realize there's something more. And we're just saying, I'm saying, I can't convince you that the Bible is accurate, that the Bible is true in all that it says, but I can point you to it, and I can point you to everything you could dig up to disprove it. And I think if you were being honest with yourself, just like any good investigator, you would come to the realization that if not wholly true, there's something to it. Thanks for being with us today.